I pulled my coat tighter against the wind as I stepped out of the cab. It was late evening, the kind where the streetlights buzz louder than the traffic, and the cold carried straight through your bones. I was supposed to be heading home after a long day, but instead, I found myself under an overpass I hadn't driven past in years. That's when I saw it, a small tent, patched together with tarps, sitting right up against the concrete pillar. I stopped walking. My feet froze to the pavement. A shadow moved inside, and then a young man stepped out, holding a baby wrapped in a blanket far too thin for the weather. My heart stopped. His face was sharp from hunger, his eyes sunken, but I knew that face. I whispered his name before I could think. Jason? He blinked hard, staring at me like I was some kind of ghost. His lips parted. Then he said it. Grandma? But you're dead. The words cut deeper than the wind. I felt my stomach drop, the way you do when an elevator jerks too fast. For a second, the world tilted. My hands shook so badly I had to grip the edge of the guardrail just to stay steady. He thought I was dead. My own grandson, standing under a bridge with his child in his arms, believed I had left this earth years ago. He wasn't lying. His voice carried no trace of drama, no joke, just confusion, fear, and something else, betrayal. My throat tightened. I wanted to speak, to explain, to reach for him. But I couldn't. Not yet. The baby squirmed in his arms and let out a soft whimper. That sound snapped me back into my body. The smell of gasoline mixed with damp cardboard filled the air. The roar of cars overhead made it hard to think straight. My grandson, the boy I once held on his very first birthday, was standing in front of me like a stranger, convinced I'd been buried long ago. Let me tell you something. People imagine moments like this come with thunder, or some kind of sign. But they don't. They sneak up on you in places where no one is watching. And when they do, you're left standing still, wondering if maybe the life you thought you had was never really yours to begin with. I forced myself to breathe. My lips moved before my mind caught up. I'm here. I never left. My voice came out shaky, weaker than I wanted. Jason clutched the baby tighter, his eyes darting as if someone might leap out and snatch me away. He didn't believe me. Not really. And in that instant, I realized this wasn't just about me being here. This was about everything he had been told, every story he had grown up with, every lie that had shaped his world. I felt the sting of tears pressing, but I wouldn't let them fall. Not yet. My chest was burning, like someone had set a match to old paper inside me. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions. Who told him I was gone? How long had he been out here? Where was his father? But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I took one small step closer. My shoes crunched against the gravel. Jason flinched, pulling the baby back against his chest, like I was a threat. That nearly broke me, to see fear in the eyes of the boy I once sang lullabies to. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't push. I just whispered again, softer this time. Jason, it's me, your grandma. His face twisted, torn between hope and disbelief. I could see it. He wanted to believe. But something years of silence, years of lies stood between us, like a wall higher than the bridge above our heads. And that's when I knew. The truth I was holding on to, the secret I had carried for years, was going to break him. Maybe even break us both. Before I go any further, if you've been watching and your heart is already pounding like mine was that night, take a second right now to tap that like button, hit subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. That way, you won't miss what happens next, because what came after under that bridge is something I never imagined I'd live through. Now, let's go back, because to understand why my grandson believed I was dead, you have to know what my family did long before that night. Let's return to the beginning with me, the person who should have been there all along. When I tell you I thought I knew what I was walking into that night, believe me, I did. In my mind, I pictured something completely different. A reunion maybe. A hug that would make up for lost years. I imagined Jason opening the door of a modest apartment, maybe with a tired smile, maybe with a question, but at least with a roof overhead. I pictured myself handing him a bag of groceries, fussing over the baby, scolding him gently for not calling sooner. Something ordinary, something safe. Instead, the reality was concrete pillars covered in spray paint, the sharp echo of car tires above, and the bitter smell of oil seeping into damp air. The only warmth came from a dented lantern outside his tent. The baby's blanket looked like it had been pulled from a thrift bin 10 years ago. Every detail scraped against the picture I'd been carrying in my head, and it left me standing there like I'd walked into the wrong life. Jason didn't invite me in. He just shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clutching that baby so close I could barely see its face. His shoulders were hunched, his jaw tight, the way people look when they're bracing for bad news. "Why are you here?" he asked. Not curious, accusing. The words stung worse than the cold. And here's the thing, I wasn't supposed to be a stranger. I was supposed to be the grandma who showed up at birthday parties, who sent cards with a $20 bill folded inside, who slipped extra dessert on the plate when no one was looking. That was the role I thought I would get. But somewhere between what I believed and what he'd been told, that role had been ripped away. The sound of a horn blared from the highway above, and the baby startled, letting out a thin cry. Jason rocked him automatically, but I could see his hands trembling. His knuckles were raw, cracked from the cold. That detail burned itself into my mind. My grandson wasn't supposed to look like this. I tried to fill the silence. "I came to see you. I didn't know you were..." I stopped myself before the word slipped out. "Homeless." I couldn't say it. My mouth wouldn't shape it. He gave me a look then. Sharp. Defensive. The kind of look you give someone who has no idea what they're talking about. "You didn't know anything," he said flatly. And maybe he was right. I thought about the last time I had heard his voice, years earlier, on a scratchy phone call that ended too quickly. After that, updates trickled down like rumors. A letter here. A half story there. My family always acted like I was asking too many questions, like wanting to know about my grandson was somehow inconvenient. So I convinced myself he was fine. Fine is a dangerous word. Fine makes you look away when you should dig deeper. Fine keeps you from seeing the warning signs. I stood there under that bridge realizing fine had been a lie. The air carried a damp chill that settled deep in my bones, but I couldn't leave. I kept looking around, trying to piece together how long they had been living like this. A couple of empty water bottles lay on the ground. A small pile of diapers sat in a grocery bag by the tent flap, and there was a folded-up stroller leaning against the wall, the wheels bent. They weren't passing through. They were surviving here. Jason must have seen me taking it all in because his shoulders tensed even more. "Don't look at us like that," he muttered. I opened my mouth to protest, to say I wasn't judging, but he cut me off. "You weren't here, not when it mattered." That hit harder than anything else he had said, because he wasn't wrong. I wanted to explain about the letters that never reached me, the calls I never got, the stories I'd been told. I wanted to tell him I hadn't abandoned him, that I had been kept away, but the words stuck in my throat. He wouldn't have believed me, not then. The baby shifted again, letting out a soft cough. Jason kissed the top of his head and looked away from me, like he couldn't bear to hold my gaze. That was the moment I knew we couldn't keep standing in the shadows of that bridge. If I wanted to make things right, I had to pull him out of there. Still, part of me hesitated. You don't just walk back into someone's life after years and expect them to trust you. Trust is built brick by brick, and ours had been bulldozed. I tried anyway. "Jason," I said gently, "let me help. You and the baby. Come with me." He shook his head instantly. "We're fine." That word again. Fine. It nearly broke me. The cars above thundered on, and I realized time was slipping. I couldn't stand there frozen, wishing for the picture I had made up in my head. The reality was in front of me, trembling in the cold, and if I didn't act, I might lose him all over again. I thought the shock of finding him would be the hardest part. But I was wrong. The hardest part was realizing how many years of silence stood between us. Years that turned me into a ghost in his story. Years that convinced him his grandmother was gone. And before the night was over, I would find out why he believed that lie, and why the truth about his father would change everything. This wasn't the first time my family had rewritten me out of the story. Standing there with Jason under that bridge, it all started to replay in my mind like a cruel slideshow. I realized this moment wasn't an accident. It was the result of years of choices, silences, and half-truths that piled up until the boy in front of me thought his grandmother was buried. The first time I felt it was years ago, at my own son's wedding. I had flown across the country, dressed in my best, ready to watch him start a new life. The ceremony was beautiful, but when the family photos came, I noticed something strange. I was always on the edge of the frame, cut off, cropped just enough to look like I wasn't part of the center. I brushed it off at the time, told myself it was coincidence. But later, when the album came out, half the pictures didn't include me at all. It was as if someone had decided I wasn't essential to the story they wanted to tell. Then came the birthdays. I mailed gifts, small but thoughtful. A baseball glove for Jason when he turned 8, a sketchbook when he was 12. I even sent a handmade quilt I had worked on for months, each square stitched with care. None of them reached him. My son would call, thanking me politely, but Jason never mentioned them. Years later, I learned he never saw them. They were tucked away, given to charity, or claimed lost in the mail. I wondered how many times he sat on his birthday, feeling forgotten, while I sat at home believing I had reached him. And then there was the Thanksgiving dinner. I had driven 5 hours to be there, pies in the back seat, heart full of hope. When I arrived, my daughter-in-law greeted me at the door with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "We didn't think you'd make it," she said flatly. At the table, there was no seat saved for me. I ended up squeezed into a corner chair meant for the kids, far from Jason, who barely looked my way. I tried to tell myself it was just poor planning. But inside, I knew better. I was being erased slowly, politely, under the excuse of logistics and misunderstandings. Each of those moments left a mark, but I stayed quiet. I told myself not to stir trouble, not to create rifts. Family matters are complicated, I reasoned. Maybe if I waited long enough, things would smooth over. That's the lie we tell ourselves when we're desperate to keep the illusion of harmony. Now, standing in the shadows of that bridge, it all made sense. The wedding photos, the missing gifts, the empty seat at Thanksgiving, every small act had built to this. Jason's belief that I was dead wasn't sudden. It was planted, nurtured, watered by silence until it grew into fact. I wanted to ask who told him. Did his father say it? His mother? Did they sit him down one night and tell him his grandmother was gone? Or was it slipped casually into conversation, the way you mention someone who moved away? I didn't ask. I could see in his eyes that he had carried that belief for so long, it had settled deep, like roots under concrete. I thought back to the last real conversation I had with my son, Jason's father. It had ended with slammed words and a door closing between us. He had shouted about independence, about how he didn't need my interference. I had shouted back about responsibility, about how raising a child meant more than paying bills and running from problems. Neither of us listened. That was the night he walked out and didn't come back. Since then, updates came secondhand. My sister would say, "They're doing fine." My cousin would add, "Jason's growing fast." Always vague, always distant. I asked for phone numbers, addresses, ways to stay in touch. They promised to pass my notes along. They never did. I convinced myself they were busy. Deep down, I think I knew they were keeping me away. Looking at Jason that night, I realized the cost of all those years of silence. He grew up thinking I didn't care, thinking I was gone. And now here he was, a father himself, standing where no one should stand with a baby in his arms and a highway above his head. My chest ached with a mix of guilt and anger, guilt for not fighting harder, anger at those who had stolen my place in his life. But I swallowed it down. The boy in front of me didn't need my anger. He needed truth. He needed someone to finally say out loud what had been hidden for too long. And yet, I hesitated. Because the truth wasn't simple. The truth wasn't just that his grandmother was alive. It was darker. It was about his father, the man who had disappeared from his life in ways Jason didn't yet understand. The night air pressed heavier around us. The baby whimpered again, and Jason rocked him, avoiding my eyes. I thought of all the times I had wanted to reach out, all the years wasted. And I knew that what I was about to tell him would break open everything he thought he knew about his family. I stood there trying to find the right words, realizing there were none. Only the truth. And once it was spoken, there would be no going back. The night after I found Jason under that bridge, I couldn't sleep. His words, "But you're dead," kept replaying in my head, each time sharper than the last. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my small apartment, listening to the hum of the heater, and wondering how many years he had carried that lie. I knew I couldn't let another day pass, so I made a decision. If Jason wouldn't come to me, I would go to him, and this time, I wouldn't leave without him. By sunrise, I was already driving back to that overpass. The streets were quiet, the air biting. When I pulled up, I saw the same tent, the same battered stroller, the same silence that seemed to hang like a heavy curtain. Jason was outside, rocking the baby against his chest. His eyes were hollow, ringed with sleeplessness. For a second, he looked like a child himself, and my heart broke all over again. "Jason," I called softly, not wanting to startle him. He looked up, startled anyway, his jaw tightening the way it had the night before. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered. "I can't walk away from you," I said. My voice cracked, but I kept going. "I've already lost too many years. I won't lose more." He didn't answer, just shifted the baby, pressing his cheek against that tiny head. I could see his guard rising, but also something else, hesitation. That's when I played the only card I had left. "Come with me, just for today. No strings, no promises. Just let me give you a warm bed tonight." He laughed bitterly. "And tomorrow? You'll disappear again?" "I never disappeared, Jason. They told you I was gone. But I was here all along. I never stopped looking for you." The words hung between us, fragile and heavy. He shook his head like he couldn't let himself believe it. But when the baby coughed a deep, rattling sound that didn't belong in a child so small, I saw fear flash across his face. Fear stronger than his anger. That was my opening. "Please," I whispered. "For him. Not for me. For him." End of chapter. Jason closed his eyes, jaw clenched, then gave a small, reluctant nod. That was all I needed. I led him to my car, helped him strap the baby into the seat. For the first time, I saw the full weight of his exhaustion. His hands trembled as he buckled the straps, and I realized he had probably been fighting alone for far too long. The ride was silent except for the baby's soft breaths. Jason stared out the window, jaw set, eyes glassy. I didn't push, I just drove. And instead of heading to my apartment, I took him straight to the airport. His eyes widened when he saw where we were. "What are we doing here?" "You're coming with me," I said firmly. "You and the baby. Somewhere safe." He frowned. "I don't have money for flights." "You don't need money," I replied, leading him through the quiet terminal toward the private hangar. His steps faltered when he saw the small jet waiting on the tarmac. This is yours?" he asked, his voice sharp with disbelief. "It's ours," I corrected gently. "And it's taking us home." He didn't argue after that. We boarded in silence, the hum of the engines filling the gaps where our words should have been. I settled across from him, watching as he clutched the baby, eyes darting around the cabin like he didn't belong. My chest tightened at the sight. He was my grandson, my flesh and blood, and yet he looked more like a stranger invited by accident. When the plane lifted off, he finally spoke. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the engines. "Why now? Why find me after all this time?" I hesitated, because the answer wasn't easy. My hands shook as I reached into my bag and pulled out a thin envelope I had carried for years. Inside was a copy of Jason's birth certificate. I slid it across the table. He picked it up with one hand, the other still cradling the baby. His eyes scanned the page. Then they stopped. His breath caught. He looked up at me, eyes wide. This isn't right." "It's the truth," I whispered. "Your father isn't who you think he island. He didn't die. He was pushed away. They told you I was gone to protect a secret about him, but I never left you, not once." For a long time, Jason said nothing. His fingers tightened on the paper, crumpling its edges. The baby stirred, letting out a soft cry, but Jason didn't seem to hear. His face was pale, his jaw clenched. his eyes shimmering with something between rage and grief. "You knew?" he finally choked out. I nodded slowly. "I knew, and I thought I was protecting you by staying quiet. But silence is what destroyed us." He leaned back, his head hitting the leather seat, staring at the ceiling like it could give him answers I couldn't. His chest rose and fell in ragged breaths. Then he looked back at me, tears finally breaking free. "You let me live a lie," he whispered. I wanted to reach for him, to say something that would make it right, but there was nothing. The truth was out, and the truth had shattered him. The engines roared louder, carrying us higher into the sky. But inside that cabin, it felt like we were sinking, because for the first time, Jason wasn't just my grandson. He was a man carrying the weight of a truth he had never asked for, and I didn't know if he would ever forgive me. Jason sat in silence, staring at the birth certificate as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less cruel. His hands shook, and the baby whimpered softly against his chest. He kissed the top of that tiny head, but his eyes never left me. "All those years," he whispered, voice breaking. "All those years I thought you were gone, and you let me believe it." His anger wasn't loud. It was worse. It was quiet, sharp, measured like a blade that cuts deeper for being steady. My chest ached, but I didn't defend myself. I had tried silence before, and it only built walls between us. This time, I forced myself to face it. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought if I stayed quiet, you wouldn't carry the burden of your father's choices. I was wrong." He laughed bitterly, but tears slipped down his cheeks. "Protect me? You stole the chance for me to know the truth. I lived like an orphan with living family. Do you understand what that does to someone?" The cabin felt smaller with each word. The hum of the engines pressed in on us. I wanted to reach across the table, to hold his hand the way I had when he was a boy learning to write his name. But he pulled back before I even moved, shielding himself with the baby as though I was the one who might hurt him. "You weren't there," he said louder now. "Not at my graduations, not when I was sick, not when I had nothing but empty cupboards and bills I couldn't pay. You weren't there, and now you tell me you could have been?" His voice cracked on the last word, the kind of crack that came from years of strain. "I was there in every way I could be," I said softly. "But they—" I stopped myself before pointing fingers. The truth was complicated. Yes, my family had twisted stories, cut me out of pictures, intercepted letters, but I had also let it happen. I had convinced myself that waiting quietly was safer than fighting loudly. Jason shook his head, disbelief hardening his features. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you." The baby stirred again, this time crying harder, the thin wail echoing through the cabin. Jason rocked him desperately, but the child's cries grew sharper, more frantic. I leaned forward, instinct taking over. "Here, let me—" "No!" Jason snapped, clutching the baby tighter. His whole body shook, caught between fury and exhaustion, but the baby only cried louder, tiny fists flailing. At last, Jason broke, his voice ragged. "I can't do this alone." That was my moment. I stood, moved slowly, and placed my hand gently on the baby's back. He hesitated, then let me take the child into my arms. The cries softened, then quieted to hiccups. Jason stared at me, tears streaming freely now, his face crumpled in defeat. "He trusts you," Jason whispered, "more than he trusts me." "No," I corrected softly. "He trusts us, and he needs both of us to stop hiding from the truth." The silence after that was heavier than any shouting match. Jason leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his face buried in his hands. The baby drifted back to sleep against my shoulder, the warmth of his small body grounding me. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of family, not the polished version you show in photos, but the messy, broken kind that forces you to choose whether you'll fight for it or let it collapse. Jason lifted his head, eyes swollen and red. "What about him?" he asked, voice barely audible. "What about my father?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I wanted to give him hope, to say his father would come back, that things would make sense. But I couldn't. "Your father made choices that cost him everything. He thought walking away would keep you safe. He was wrong, and I let him convince me to stay silent. That's on me." Jason sat back, staring at the ceiling, breathing hard like he'd just run a marathon. So I was lied to by everyone. Yes, I admitted. And I can't undo that. All I can do is be here now. For you. For him. I nodded toward the baby. For the first time since I'd found him, Jason didn't argue. He didn't forgive, but he didn't push me away either. He just sat there, broken open, holding the remnants of a life built on lies. The engines roared as the plane carried us closer to home, but inside that cabin, time seemed to slow. Jason's tears dried, leaving lines on his cheeks. My arms ached from holding the baby, but I didn't let go, because I knew the second I did, everything might fall apart again. I wanted to promise him it would get better, that trust could be rebuilt, that family could heal. But promises are fragile things when truth has already shattered everything. Instead, I stayed silent, letting the weight of the moment settle, hoping he would see that my silence this time wasn't avoidance. It was presence. And when Jason finally looked at me, his eyes softer but still heavy, I realized the confrontation wasn't over. It had only just begun. The truth had been spoken, but the aftermath was waiting, and I had no idea if our family would survive it. When the plane touched down, the sun was just beginning to rise. The sky stretched wide and soft, streaked with pale orange, the kind of morning that should have felt like hope. But inside the cabin, the air was heavy, fragile, as if one wrong word might break everything all over again. Jason sat stiffly, the baby asleep against his chest, while I gathered my bag and tried to summon the courage for what came next. We stepped onto the tarmac, the cold air rushing in to greet us. Jason squinted against the light, his free hand shielding the baby's tiny face. He looked younger in that moment, almost like the boy I remembered, but the weight in his shoulders betrayed how much older life had forced him to become. I walked a few steps ahead, then slowed, making sure not to push him. I had dragged him onto this journey. I couldn't drag him into the next step. A car waited to take us from the airport. Jason hesitated before climbing in, his eyes flicking toward me, like he still wasn't sure whether to trust the ground beneath his feet. The ride was quiet. He stared out the window, lips pressed tight, while the baby stirred softly in his arms. I wanted to fill the silence, to tell him stories about the man he used to be before life hardened him, but I stayed quiet. After years of forced silence, this silence felt different. It wasn't absence. It was space for him to breathe, to process, to choose. When we pulled up to my house, he blinked at it like it was a picture from another world. It wasn't a mansion, just a modest home, 2 bedrooms, a porch that creaked when you stepped on it. But compared to the bridge, compared to tarps and broken strollers, it must have looked like another planet. He didn't move right away, just sat there clutching the baby, eyes scanning the house as if it might vanish if he blinked. "Come inside," I said gently. "No pressure, just warmth, just rest." He hesitated, then nodded once. I opened the door, and for the first time in years, I watched my grandson step into my home. Inside, the smell of coffee lingered from the pot I had left brewing before we left. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, dust motes spinning lazily in the beams. It wasn't grand, but it was safe. Jason lowered himself onto the couch, still holding the baby, while I hurried to fetch a blanket, a pillow, something to make them comfortable. When I came back, Jason had leaned his head back, eyes closed, lips pressed against his son's forehead. The sight nearly unraveled me. He looked so tired, but for the first time since I'd found him, he also looked like he had allowed himself to stop running. I draped the blanket over his shoulders, careful not to wake the baby. He didn't open his eyes, but his lips moved, whispering words almost too soft to catch. "Why now?" I sat down across from him, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. "Because I couldn't stand one more day knowing you were out there believing I was gone. Because I should have fought harder years ago, but I didn't. And because I want to fight now, even if it's late." He opened his eyes then, and for the first time, I saw something shift. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something smaller, quieter, a crack in the wall. The baby stirred, letting out a tiny cry. Jason adjusted him clumsily, and I reached out instinctively. Let me. He hesitated, then carefully passed the baby into my arms. That small act, that tiny transfer of trust, meant more than any speech could. I cradled the child against me, his soft breath warming my neck, and I thought of all the moments I had lost. First steps, first words, birthdays, and Christmas mornings. They were gone, stolen by silence and distance, but this moment was here, and I would not waste it. Jason leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching me rock his son. His eyes were still rimmed with red, but softer now. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. I don't know how to forgive. I don't even know if I want to. You don't have to know today, I said. All you have to do is let me be here. Not as a ghost, not as a rumor, as me, your grandmother, the one who should have never left your side. He didn't answer right away. He just sat there, breathing heavily, as if the weight of everything was finally pressing down all at once. Then he nodded, barely, but enough. The baby's tiny hand curled around my finger, and in that simple gesture, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Belonging. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't healing. But it was a beginning. Hours later, after Jason finally lay down and drifted into exhausted sleep on the couch, I sat in the quiet house with his child in my arms. The ticking of the old clock on the wall was steady, comforting. I thought about the years we had lost, the lies that had poisoned our family, and the truth that had shattered him. And I wondered if we could ever rebuild what had been broken. I don't know if Jason will forgive me. I don't know if the truth about his father will ever stop burning in his chest. I don't know if the cracks in our family can ever truly mend. But I do know this. My grandson is not alone under a bridge anymore. He is here, in my home, with his child, safe for now. And as long as I am breathing, I will not let him believe I am gone ever again. The story isn't neat. It isn't finished. But maybe that's what makes it real. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough for us to begin again.